neighbors. Now we can be friends.
An historic announcement this week, the U.S. and Cuba will reestablish diplomatic relations and open embassies.
The View from South Florida, what changes? And as important, what does not?
Possession of pot in Miami-Dade becomes a minor offense. Lighting up in public does not.
Good morning, welcome, and happy 4th of July weekend when freedom and independence gets the headline.
Indeed, happy 239th birthday to the great USA. We are glad you're spending part of this holiday weekend with us. We are going to begin this morning with a major breakthrough that happened this week in relations between the U.S. and Cuba. President Obama announced the U.S. and Cuba have agreed to restore full diplomatic relations and open embassies. That will happen later this month.
And of course, that is a major step toward normal relations between two countries that have been at odds more than half a century. The U.S. remains at odds with Cuba over the treatment of dissidents and political prisoners. And the Castro government insists the U.S. lift the embargo and return Guantanamo.
One former head of the U.S. Centrist section in Havana says to get to this point, the U.S. has given up a lot, and Castro, he says, hasn't given up anything.
I think we've lost in this in this first round because we don't really know what we've gained in terms of normalization.
Dr. Andy Gomez, whom you see here, is a senior fellow at the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami. He is widely recognized as one of the leading experts on Cuba, and so too, for that matter, is Professor Jorge Duany, director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University and a professor of anthropology.
Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Good to see you again.
Andy Gomez, the devil is in the details. I mean, this is a big announcement, but without funding from Congress and with a fight to ever confirm an ambassador, does this ever happen?
Oh, sure. I think the next step after the raising of the flags July 20th most likely will be to appoint an ambassador during the recess when Congress goes home for the summer, not to worry about a confirmation hearing in the Senate. And then we'll have to see where the summer will take us.
And Andy, you had mentioned to me late this week when we spoke that you thought that a good possibility would be Jeffrey de Laurentiis, who is a career diplomat. He now heads the U.S. Centrist section in Havana. He apparently is respected by the Cubans. He respects them, and it would not create any kind of a furor the way that a political nominee would.
I think the likelihood is that Jeff will probably be man in charge. I don't know for how long, because I keep hearing rumors that there are many others on the list that President Obama might appoint this summer. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah.
I still think we need to go back to right now. There is a funding bill for the State Department that specifically blocks funding for an embassy in Cuba. Dr. Duany, how do you run an embassy without funding for the people and the resources in it?
Well, the U.S. intersection is already the biggest diplomatic mission in Cuba, so I think they'll run it just like they have right now. Of course, they would like to have more funding to expand, for instance, consular officers and so on, because I think it's to be expected that more Cubans will want to have a visa to migrate to the United States. But for the moment, I think for the next few months, they'll run it just like it is.
You know, I asked Jim Kaysen, the former head of the interest section, now the mayor of Coral Gables, about the interest section and how it runs. I found it fascinating. He says the Cubans limit our diplomatic staff now to 51 people, but about 350 Cubans who are assigned by the Cuban government work there, and also some spouses of other diplomats in the country. But he says to issue 20,000 visas per year with the staff they have is just a huge, huge task. I mean, this is a busy place.
As you know, I know Jim very well, not even before the days of mayor in Coral Gables, which he's done an unbelievable job. I think the big issue here, the big announcement, when President Obama made that Secretary Kerry will be traveling to Havana on July 20th to raise the American flag, was the fact that the Cubans had actually agreed to let American diplomats travel through the island to meet with people, opposition leaders, and dissidents, as long as you inform their foreign ministry 24 hours before. That was a real sticking point between both delegations as negotiated this. How long this is going to happen and how long they're going to let it go, we'll have to see. But again, change has happened.
But there are still so many sticking points.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The issue, for instance, the issue of human rights.
Of course.
I mean,
That's the
which,
big issue.
To me, it's a personal issue too, as a Cuban. The issue of political prisoners. How much is going to happen between July and the Pope's visit in September? What is Pope Francis going to say on this issue before or during his visit to Cuba? It will be very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the Cuban side, they have made a distinction between normalization of relations and the establishment of diplomatic relations. Normalization will take much longer because it involves all these issues that Andy just mentioned, and also on the Cuban side, the question of Guantanamo, the Cuban Adjustment Act, the Martí radio and TV stations, all kinds of differences that are still there.
And compensation, Jorge, for the alleged damages caused by the embargo for the last 55 years or so.
And what about the compensation due for American property?
American claims that were
There you go. Those are the main issues. And of course, in the long run, it's the embargo as well. I mean, Cuba is insisting on lifting the embargo, and that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, and another issue I'm sure Glenna was just going to mention too is U.S. fugitives from justice.
Absolutely.
Who are on the island.
Absolutely.
And as the Herald points out this morning, in addition to Joanne Chesimard, Santa Shakur, there are 70 people who have fled prosecution or prison in the United States.
That we know of.
That we know of, yeah, that we know of.
I mean, as Jorge said, establishing diplomatic relations is a big deal. Reconciliation of all these issues, this can take, not months, it can take years.
Right.
After 56 years, well, 54 years and no relationships.
Right.
You know, what we have talked about so much when we discuss Cuba and Cuban relations, there's so much talk about how the U.S. has given so much, the Castro government has given nothing. And I just want to be clear, that's not a judgment call, it's a fact that the Castro government itself repeatedly says, we're talking, we'll move, but we are not changing economically, we are not changing politically. And that's a huge block to some people looking at this, especially from this community, and saying,
And
what are we
especially in
doing?
Congress, yeah.
Well, you know, as I told Michael the other day, let me speculate a little bit here, and I don't know if Jorge would agree with me or not. That was a pretty strong message coming out of the Cubans the other day. We're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, and we expect Gitmo, and we expect economic, for you guys to compensate us for economic. Was that a message to the Americans? Or was that a message to the all Cuban leadership? Fidel's still alive. And I, for one, never expected any of this stuff would have happened while Fidel was alive. Was that message from Raul to the old guard or to Washington, D.C.? Maybe both.
Well, you know, interestingly enough, we have some new and fresh video of Fidel Castro.
Yeah,
hopefully
let's
we'll
see
have it queued up. He was out and about for the first time yesterday in Havana since the December announcement by President Obama about the relations. That what he's doing here is meeting with the island's premier cheesemakers, according to CNN. Why, I'm not sure. Well, is this a sign as well? Is this a public appearance for some reason that we don't yet realize?
Well, Fidel has appeared several times since December 17, and I remember it took quite a long time for him to appear in photographs and then also to write a letter. And some people might remember that letter said that he didn't really like the negotiations, but he wasn't against it either. And then he said he didn't trust the Americans. And I think that was the first public statement that he wasn't going to go against his brother, against Raul. So he must be aware of the situation, but of course he's no longer the key player that he was before. And Raul has shown the world to be a much more pragmatic leader than Fidel, and I think that's the reason why this is taking place right now. And perhaps they bring out Fidel every now and then just to show that he's alive, but not really calling the shots.
Yeah, and would you also not say, and you pointed this out to me the other day, Andy, that Raul was looked upon as some kind of a weakling younger brother. He has actually been more effective in the 5 years that he has been the president, the acting head of Cuba, than I think almost everybody expected.
I think, Michael, many of us, particularly me, we underestimated Raul Castro's capability. Many that used to work in the Cuban government and close to the Castro brothers who have defected and are here in the United States, South Florida, all told me over the years, Raul is very capable, and as you said, and Jorge also mentioned, very pragmatic in terms of approaching these issues. Keep in mind that Fidel always operated on whims. What we have seen from Raul Castro is what I call trying to institutionalize the Cuban Revolution, trying to, for instance, he's brought back the Communist Party, which Fidel could, you know, didn't care. Now you see the Communist Party meeting, you know, so often, you know, so many years.
You know, you mentioned defections. There were 2 defections this week, baseball players. We'll take a quick break. We'll talk about that when we come back. Stay with us.
Welcome back. Live in our studio this morning, we have 2 of the leading experts on Cuba and U.S.-Cuba relations, Dr. Andy Gomez of the University of Miami, Dr. Jorge Duani of FIU, and we should point out that we had invited, I thought we had invited Orlando Gutierrez, who is a national secretary of the Cuban Democratic Directorate, and apparently there was a miscommunication. We apologize to him, and also we would have liked to have heard from him because his organization very strongly opposes this initiative by the Obama administration.
All right, that said, we were talking about the 2 baseball players who defected this week. Interesting to anybody that is a casual observer that with all what seems like rapprochement and relations being restored, why would Cubans still defect?
Well, I think Cuba still hasn't made it clear exactly what the position of those baseball players can be. I mean, they actually play anywhere else but in the United States. They play in Mexico, they play in Venezuela, so it's the U.S. Thing that hasn't been resolved yet.
But doesn't it channel still that among the Cuban people, there is still a yearning for something more? And it may be economic, it may be political, it may be freedom, but what is it that we need to understand about people who are still choosing any opportunity that they can to defect?
These negotiations between both countries and now establishing diplomatic relations has created a new level of expectations inside the island for change. Now, let's use that word very carefully. Change still doesn't have a definition on the island. It can be good, it can be bad, depending on where you are at. The young people in Cuba want change faster than any regime, including theirs, can give it to them. And that's why we see over 100,000 young Cubans in Quito, Ecuador, trying to get into the United States via Mexico. The older generations, we have seen countries that have transitioned, are very skeptical because they don't know what change is going to bring. In other words, Raul Castro is breaking down the box that they have lived for over 56 years. And that, as we have seen in other countries, the reunification of Germany creates a certain psychological trauma that is sometimes very difficult to adjust to.
Yeah. You know, if I can, let me ask you both, I mean, you are such experts here, to explain a little bit about the historical context in which this rapprochement is taking place. First of all, Cuba needs a sugar daddy. And the Soviet Union did that until 1992. Then it disintegrated. And then, after a couple of very difficult years, the special period, Venezuela under Chavez began to give them, and still gives them, some oil, which they keep some, they resell others on the open market. But Venezuela, I mean, the price of oil has halved, and Venezuela is a mess. So, I mean, isn't that all part of why Raul Castro, to keep the revolution alive, would say, okay, we'll make a deal with the United States?
Definitely, I think the Venezuela factor is one of the reasons why the Cuban government has engaged in these conversations, and the economic motivation is one of them. The other one, I think, is that Cuba, again, has entered into a more pragmatic relationship with the rest of the world, and it deals with many other governments that it doesn't agree with, and so why not do it with the United States, which is the natural market and the main source of investment in any future Cuba, including members of the Cuban American community that are already perhaps not investing but sending millions of dollars every year to provide for small businesses that are, you know, not controlled by the government.
Well, there are right now business people in Cuba right now from South Florida as well doing some sort of reconnaissance, exploration and putting the groundwork in place. I mean, this is a business deal of gigantic proportions.
Glenna, you know, I dare to say, let me think like the Cubans, because I don't think, to understand the Cubans on the island, you can't think like us Cubans in Miami or Washington, D.C. By, as Jorge pointed out so eloquently. By establishing relationship with the United States, is opening up Cuba to the rest of the world. Cuba, I think, is going to be very selective of who is going to be able to invest internationally
They're
on
just
the
not
island.
going to take the first offer.
No.
Or
Look what happened with Google the other day, that
Yeah.
Google offered them to establish the entire infrastructure, and they said no. However, I think what they really want from the United States is tourism,
Yeah.
which can help their economy tremendously.
Well, on that score, if I can, let me put a quote up here on the screen so people at home can read it. Here is what the head of Norwegian Cruise Lines said the other day in an interview with the New York Times. I can't stop thinking about it. Cuba and the cruise industry are just a match made in heaven waiting to happen. That's Frank Del Rio, who I believe is Cuban-American, the CEO of one of the largest cruise lines here. And you know, don't you, Jorge, that Carnival and Royal Caribbean and the other cruise lines are just chafing for the opportunity to make Cuba a major stop.
Sure. And I actually participated a couple of weeks ago in a major hotel and tourism industry meeting, and that was the main thinking of the group there, that when it's legal to expand the tourist market to Cuba, and it's not legal right now, people have to go on a number of 12 different legal categories. At least 4 million people are expected to go to Cuba in the first year, so that's a big increase in the market.
What about cruise lines that have ships that are not flagged in the United States? Isn't it perfectly legal for them to berth in any port they would like?
Under the new regulations, I think they are.
But
now,
they can't come back here,
Right.
excuse me.
Yes, and also they're waiting for the Cubans to give permission to these cruise ships to...
Well,
to
the Herald had a story, did it not? I think Saturday, that said that MSC Cruises, which is based out of Geneva, was going to have the ship Divina stationed in Miami, but it's going to be sailing out of Havana.
You got
this winter.
a couple of issues that are working against the Cubans. Number one is their current infrastructure. The only port right now with a big one of these big cruise liners that can go in are Mariel, the new free trade zone, or our Guantanamo base, and I can guarantee you they're not going to go there while it's still ours. The Havana harbor still needs a lot of work in order to allow these cruise liners. Right now there's only 35,000 hotel rooms in Cuba. So one of the reasons they see the cruise ships as a positive is, as we all do it, they're a living hotel.
You know, we actually were there together in the mid-90s when this fledgling tourism industry in Cuba was just being built. Everybody wanted to work in the tourist industry because that's where they get foreign currency, much more than their monthly stipend. Does this not create a sort of double-class society that Cuba has worked so hard to say does not exist?
The Cubans talk about it in terms of tourist apartheid, which is that dramatic, and it has racial overtones as well. So,
how so?
Well, because most of the people who have been able to work as waiters or people in the tourism business are light-skinned, and apparently the industry does prefer to hire white people rather than black people. The other one has to do with a regional imbalance, because as Andy just mentioned, most of the tourist facilities are located in the western side of the island, Havana and Varadero, whereas the eastern side, especially Oriente, doesn't really have any major tourist facilities.
Andy, let me ask you the question. Maybe I should have asked this first question. I think a really critical issue here is, what does the rapprochement mean to the average Cuban? Will it change his or her life?
That's such a good question, Michael. For the Cubans on the island, I don't think so. Because all economic transition models that I have seen throughout, the fall of the Soviet Union has not really brought improvement in society for those countries. And I really don't see it unless, as Jorge pointed out, Cubans on the island work for the tourism industry. And those are very carefully selected because all of them speak English as well, too, and they understand that.
Right. What about Afro-Cubans?
Well, that's where I was going next. The majority of the population, particularly in eastern Cuba, is Afro-Cuban. They don't get any help from the minority, from the majority of whites in exile.
Right.
I mean, they are the majority in Cuba. And you can see it even in the representation of Afro-Cubans in the political structure of the Cuban government. So the question remains, how quickly would this change, would this business opportunity improve the circumstances for Cuba? They just raised their salaries, their average salary for a month ago from $20 to $24 a month. Now, in 6 months, if that's raised to $100, that's a lot of money. But in comparison, that is absolutely nothing. And I think particularly the young Cubans understand that. So we have to wait and see. I just don't think that these economic changes, if they come fast, no matter how fast they come, will bring about positive changes with the Cuban people. And then there's the issue again of human rights.
Human rights.
So appreciate your insight this morning, and we will be talking about this for
A long time.
a long
Years to
time.
come.
Thanks so much for being
Jorge,
here.
thank you. Andy,
My
thanks
pleasure as
very
always.
much.
Good to see you both.
Next, taking a toll, the soaring cost of highway driving. It's just one of the topics we take to the roundtable. Stay with us. The headlines this week in South Florida included the costs of your commute and the cost of having marijuana, and those are just some of the topics that we take to the roundtable this morning.
Doug Hanks, shall I go on? Yes, Doug Hanks, there he is, covers Miami-Dade County government for the Miami Herald, and this week his stories focused on the county's new pot ordinance and tolls collected by the County Expressway Authority.
Nancy Ankrum is a roundtable regular. She is the editorial page editor of the Herald.
And we are happy to welcome Tim Paget, the Americas correspondent for WLRN Public Radio, former bureau chief in Mexico City, and Miami correspondent for both Newsweek and Time magazines. Great to have you here, Tim.
Thank you.
Resident Cuba expert for our purposes at the roundtable today.
Great.
Yeah, let's begin there. We sent a reporter, perhaps we shouldn't have, but we sent a reporter on Wednesday afternoon down to Cafe Versailles, which is sort of, you know, Cuba's central.
Sort of cliche.
The go-to
is what it
It
is.
is.
Right.
Well, it is, and maybe it shouldn't be the go-to place. But the fact of the matter is, he found two protesters, both of them members of a group called the Vigilia Mambisa, which is a really hardline anti-Castro group, and God bless them, they have every right to be. But there was a lot of ambivalence down even at Versailles about this. People saying, well, I'm not crazy about Castro, but let's sort of give it a chance.
Look, last week was the 15th anniversary of the end of the Elian Gonzalez story, which I think a lot of us would just rather forget. But it's a great focal point because that's when things really started to change here in the Cuban-American community. And in those 15 years, you've seen a generational shift. You've seen younger, more moderate Cuban-Americans come to the fore. You've seen Cubans who are more recently arrived than the traditional exile cohort, and they share much different opinions about engaging with
they
Cuba.
still have family members back on the island.
Exactly, exactly. For them, Cuba is not just Fidel Castro. It's a brother, it's a sister, it's an aunt, an uncle, etc. So those more moderate voices have come to the forefront in the past 10, 15 years, and that's why you're not seeing the outbursts of protest over this new policy and engagement.
And how much of it is just a 50 years worth of a policy that has not worked? And even if perception hasn't changed, maybe the desire to try something else to effort that change might work.
You talk to most what they call themselves ABCs, American-born Cubans, and they'll say, look, we want to see regime change in Cuba too. But after a half century of not seeing anything really change in that respect, it's time to get our foot in the door inside Cuba as the way to start more effectively influencing the change that our parents and grandparents wanted to see over the past half century.
Nancy Ankrum, you watch what's going on in Congress very closely, and you know, it certainly appears to me, I mean, there are a couple of bills that have been introduced, one by Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona to lift the travel ban, and Senator Klobuchar of Wisconsin to lift the embargo. It looks like Flake's bill may have a chance, but, you know, until the 2016 presidential election is over, I don't think Congress wants to do very much.
Oh, absolutely. You know, maybe 2 weeks ago, people were touting Obama's very good week with Supreme Court wins and the speech of his career, which was a eulogy. I don't think he's going to have one of those regarding Cuba, his ability to have an ambassador there, or to lift the embargo. I don't think there is any stomach at all to do anything, as you said, until the 2016 election.
But having said that, don't we all expect before this is over to see Barack Obama one day sometime next year in Havana at our embassy, probably shaking hands with Raul, maybe at the airport with Raul Castro?
Yeah, but that's the easy part for him.
Yeah.
Taking the trip, having the photo op, making it a symbolic action, but I don't think that this president has been very, very adept, despite the wins he has received over the past few years from courts, maybe through executive order. He hasn't been very adept at moving Congress to his side.
But I think it's interesting. Obama's been here at least twice for well-publicized fundraising trips to Miami. That policy largely exists because of Miami politics. Where were the protests? Where was the pushback? I mean, I wonder if he didn't just sort of get the shift in Miami before Miami commentators did, et cetera. I think there's some surprise that we haven't seen more demonstrations.
That's an interesting point.
No, I think he did see that shift even before he took office in 2009. He did see what was going on here. And that's why I think we're seeing things happening so rapidly now.
Well, they saw the polls nationwide.
Right, and this is a community he won.
Absolutely.
Both times. So.
Right, he did. Well, if we can, let's move on to a couple of issues in local government. And Doug, you...
Other than Cuba, which is kind of local. But
well, it is
really controversial.
Yeah, and local politicians like Raul Castro. You know, spend most of your professional life down at Miami-Dade County Hall, the Stephen P. Clark building.
Perched in the little window above the commission.
Above the commission.
In isolation.
And sort of go through what they have been trying to do with the Miami-Dade Expressway Authority and tolling.
Right. Well, it's... Okay, so the Miami-Dade Expressway Authority is in charge of the toll roads. Now, why do you have a panel of appointed people in charge of toll roads? So politicians don't have to set toll rates.
But the politicians appoint the panel.
And then they say, oh my gosh, I can't believe what they're doing. So the MDX expanded tolls dramatically at the end of last year. Basically, you could drive part of the Dolphin and pay tolls, but most of the time you could drive it and not pay anything. So the people paying tolls were paying for the whole thing. So they said, we're not going to do that. We're going to close the system. So anyway, people very upset because it was a dramatic increase in what people were spending. For me personally, it was like an extra $500 a year.
And can I say, the Miami Herald did something I thought was brilliant with that toll calculator that allowed anybody to just log on, put in your route, and see that you were paying 3 or 4 or even more times the amount per year.
And voila, a refund.
Yeah. Well, and what about that? I mean, I think that is the MDX board trying to say, we hear you, we're going to give you back some percentage of what you pay. But what is the formula there? If you spend $100 every 3 weeks or 4 weeks, something?
Yeah, I don't know that we know enough to know how big of a financial event that really was, because they already have some refund program. Definitely a political event. I mean, MDX is public enemy #1 in terms of Miami-Dade politics, and everyone's trying to jump on board and do a little punching bag.
Here is the headline question for anyone that drives those roads. Once the roads are paid for, what are those tolls for? And the corollary question, why, when we're paying all these tolls and all of this maintenance and building and blah, blah, blah is going on, is 836 still a parking lot by 3 o'clock every afternoon? What is progress?
Well, first of all, the number one thing they're paying for is debt, right? I mean, you borrow the money to do this work. And I think it is interesting to consider this, okay? What's the #1 nag we hear about from America? You're not investing in infrastructure. We're letting infrastructure crumble. We're a better nation than this. Here's a public entity that is charging users and is doing a very good job with infrastructure. There's a lot of work going on the 836. They're fixing crowded interchanges. They're getting rid of a lot of the left exits. They're going to move to right. So what MDX says is like, listen, we're doing what you're asking us to.
Right, but there's a silver lining to this, though, if you're a proponent of better public transit in Miami, or I should say the non-existence of public transit in Miami. The 120%, for example, rate hike that Doug reported on was a shock. But by the same token, that's the kind of shock that could start making people think a little harder about the lack of public transit in this
and
county.
that's just what Commissioner Esteban Vovo is counting on. He's head of the county's transportation committee, and he too said 120%, that could work in this community's favor in terms of getting an east-west corridor.
You know, before we end this part of the conversation, I want to say I never drive on the MDX road, so I'm sorry you've got an extra $500. And but I often I'm downtown, and then we come up the express lanes on I-95 to get here to Channel 10. And the other day at 6:15, the cost of the express lanes from downtown up to the Golden Glades was $10.50.
Did you pay it?
Well, Channel 10 paid it. You know.
On that note, we'll be right back.
And live in our studio on this Sunday morning, our roundtable, and we're having a very robust and good discussion this morning. Nancy Ankrum of the Miami Herald, Doug Hanks, County Hall reporter for the Miami Herald, and Tim Paget of WLRN Public Radio. Doug, this week, as you reported, the Miami-Dade County Commission, on a 10-3 vote, made marijuana possession 20 grams or less a minor offense punishable by a ticket, as it were, and a $100 fine.
Right, and it's interesting. This was a very hard thing to get done, and there was a big pushback to say we are not decriminalizing possession of marijuana. So what they created was an option. So each police officer in Miami-Dade County has the option. I can charge you criminally for misdemeanor possession of marijuana, which enters the court system, et cetera, or I can just give you a ticket like I would if you were littering.
Right.
I covered this. No one ever explained how this would be implemented. How will each officer decide?
I was there too.
I mean, it was all based on marijuana arrest can ruin your life. Well, now you're telling this officer each time you can either ruin this person's life or give them a ticket.
That I think is the biggest question, because it's not about so much drug laws, it's about the application of drug laws and how they are not applied equally, and it is a racial subject. Yet there's no mechanism for any particular one officer on the street to have an objective checklist, so it's still a subjective arrest.
And that was part of
not.
our editorial when we wrote with some tepid support for this, because yes, that arrest can ruin people's lives, but we put on the director, J.D. Patterson, and also the commission, there needs to be a mechanism of monitoring so that in a year we know how this is being implemented, what discretion really means. Yes, you know, the good boy in walking down the Pinecrest Street with a joint gets a, you know, a little pat on the head, and the guy walking down the street in Gould's, well, he's in handcuffs and slammed against the, you know, the roof of a car. We know what we're going to see.
Yeah, right. And it's not just the human cost, it's also the fiscal costs. About 4 years ago, when we passed the 40-year anniversary of the drug war, a lot of researchers were pointing out that in Florida, for example, almost 2/3 of the arrests made in the state are drug-related, and you can imagine then that a lot of those are just meaningless arrests for, you know, dime bags of marijuana possession, as she's referring to. But there is a huge fiscal cost. When the drug war started back in the 70s, the corrections budget in the state was around $170 million. Today, it's more like $2.5 billion. And so if 2/3 of your arrests are drug-related, I think, you know, Miami-Dade County is simply coming to a common sense reality that other municipalities like Chicago and New York have already come to.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. This is exactly what Miami-Dade Commissioner Sally Heyman said during the discussion, and she cited figures, and I don't remember exactly, Doug, but it was something like it costs, if you arrest somebody, and usually young black guys, on one sole possession of marijuana charge, to take the time of the police officer, the public defender, the judge, you know, take them to jail, or you know, it takes in the vicinity of what, $250 or something?
It was a lot of money.
Yeah.
Added up and up and up
And
and
then
up,
the
and then
time-
it doesn't get anywhere.
Yeah, and then and generally these cases are dropped. I mean, they're null pros, but the kid remains with an arrest record.
Exactly. The record remains.
We had this discussion on this program a couple of weeks ago. Miami Beach Police Chief Dan Oates brought in his baggies of marijuana oregano to demonstrate what kind of quantity. But I got the distinct feeling from police chiefs, they're very wary of this new discretion, and they're afraid of having this be called a decriminalization.
Yeah, they are. And we should point out that Broward County, I was at their commission meeting, I think the week before, and they have ordered their county attorney to draft an ordinance, and I suspect it'll be very much like the Miami-Dade County ordinance. Can we move on to our favorite presidential candidate, Donald Trump?
Is that official? Have we decided that officially?
I mean,
just a favorite to talk about.
and you know, this week, Tim, he had still more fallout, more sponsors. I mean, Macy's has dropped his clothing line. I don't know who buys his clothing line.
The mayor.
Did you know his clothing line is
Really?
made in China?
When they cut off his tie with
was it
Richard
Trump?
Branson, it was a Trump tie.
And jackets are made in Mexico. There's a part of his line
Is
that's
there a
made in
hair
Mexico.
products line too?
Let's hope not.
Let's check.
Well, okay, so here is the question. With all of this blowback and all of this, the billions of dollars that he is purportedly going to lose, he's soaring in the polls.
Number 2 in New Hampshire.
What does that mean?
Right. I think it means he's willing to sacrifice Miss Universe to get the Republican nomination for president. And we're already seeing a number of Latin American countries, for example, dropping out of the Miss Universe contest as a result of his insults that he hurled at Mexican and Latino immigrants.
Yeah, but it's no great insight on my part. I have to say, and Nancy, I'm sure editorially you've already agreed, that this is exactly what the Republican Party doesn't need to have a future and to win the White House is, you know, you can't alienate Hispanics, which is the fastest growing minority group in this country.
That's true, except the Republicans now have only themselves to blame for not coming down on Donald forcefully enough, quickly enough, backpedaling, saying, well, no, he's wrong. Jeb Bush finally said, I take this personally, and this is not what we stand for. But, you know, these comments were made 2 weeks ago. And actually, Donald Trump's comments would have given them the perfect opportunity to really say what they stand for. And unfortunately, they have.
Do you think at that point 2 weeks ago, there were just a contingent of candidates who said, oh, this guy is just so out there, we're not going to dignify him with a response?
Oh, it's Donald Trump again. There he goes again.
I don't think so. I don't think so. No. I think there's the fear and cowardice factor.
Doug, you mentioned before we began this live discussion, where is the Professional Golf Association, the PGA? Talk about
you've
that.
seen everyone head for the axis with Trump, all the retailers, because remember, corporate America will do anything it can to pursue the Hispanic market. Now you have someone on the other side of this. It's just a complete PR disaster. But we haven't seen the PGA drop Trump. And you know that would have real consequences for Miami. When he bought the Doral, he inherited this big pro golf tournament.
A great golf tournament every year, gets the best golfers in the world. It's seen around the world, and yet the PGA is sort of pulled back.
Well, more important than golf courses, I think we finally saw Hispanic organizations deliver some real clout. There was a really good report about a meeting that took place shortly after Trump's comments between Hispanic leadership and NBC out in LA. They were really effectively able to leverage NBC to drop, or should I say fire, Trump. And I think what we're starting to see as a result of this is a real coalescence of Hispanic civic muscle.
You know, we talk so much about how the Hispanic vote is by no means a big block vote. It's so diverse, and maybe this is the one issue and the one man that unites it into somewhat of a voting bloc.
My thought is Trump did not realize this was going to happen. I think that when this is done, he's either going to be president or a former presidential candidate. I think this is very damaging for him. You know, he makes a lot of money selling condos overseas to foreign buyers.
And in sunny Isles Beach, I mean, you see the Trump brand. Well, it's all over South Florida, and that brand, I think, has been damaged. No question about it.
Absolutely.
We hope to see Donald Trump on this program with us one day soon.
Good luck with that.
Do it. He does talk to the press. We'll give him that.
Well,
he
talks at us. That's for sure.
Thank you,
Nancy,
so much
Doug, and Tim. Thank you very much for being here. Up next, a federal investigation underway into the disappearance of dozens of flamingos from the iconic flock at Hialeah Park. That is Glenna's story. She will have it when we come back. This week, Local 10 News, in the person of Glenna Milberg, broke the news that dozens of flamingos are missing from their home at Hialeah Park Racetrack.
That's right. Overnight, all of the babies born weeks ago disappeared, and now federal wildlife investigators are convinced it was a criminal act.
It's not often you get this close to the iconic flamingos of Hialeah Park.
I'm at a complete loss. I've been distraught now for a couple of days.
Park VP Dennis Testa took us in. His heartbreak so obvious. The dozens of babies hatched weeks ago, about this big, they're simply gone, every single one.
For 45 to 50 birds, just only the babies just disappear overnight is totally perplexing.
Testa took these pictures of the babies Monday evening after a windy storm that felled trees and ripped flags. The babies were all fine, but not the next morning.
Tuesday, we didn't see them at all.
Devastating, considering we've been waiting for them to hatch, and they finally do, and then they're all gone.
And we see no signs of any carcasses or predators. We searched the whole lake along the right bank.
A wildlife investigator is on the case, suggesting someone targeted and stole the babies for the black market. They are too young to fly and too small to run.
I've been here since 1958 and I've never lost a bird. It's devastating to us. I mean, this is our history, our legacy out here. The birds have been here forever.
The Florida Wildlife Commission is well familiar with a black market trade in exotic birds, and they say these baby flamingos could be worth $500 to $1,000 each.
Wow. Well, on this 4th of July weekend of pride and patriotism, how much do you and your neighbors know about basic American civics? You will hear for yourself next.
Good afternoon, South Florida. What a beautiful Sunday it's turned out to be. A great way to end the holiday weekend. Temperatures already getting close to that 90-degree mark at 89 degrees from Key West to Fort Lauderdale. This is what it feels like out there in Key West. Feels like the triple digits. This is the same story we've been dealing with basically all week. We continue with the southeast breeze. You just saw the radar. No rain out there to speak of. If we do have storms, they'll be way west of us. That's why we only have a 20% chance for rain today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Glenna?
Jennifer, thanks. As we celebrate life and liberty this weekend, we dropped in on some people selling fireworks for a pop quiz about our nation's independence.
To finish that sentence, life, liberty, and
justice for all.
Something of happiness. What is it?
Life, liberty, and
freedom.
What document starts with the line, "We the people"?
We the people? I don't know.
Name one person who signed the Declaration of Independence.
Abraham Lincoln?
All right, so props to the good sports who played along. They have plenty of company. Generally, civics is overshadowed in schools by high-stakes subjects like English and science and math, and in life by jobs and chosen downtime. But civic literacy is essential to American-style life and liberty in government by the people. We the people can't run government without knowing how it works. This week, the newest hyphenated Americans earned citizenship in ceremonies just like this one across the country. All had to pass an exam about how government works and U.S. citizens' rights and responsibilities. The U.S. Immigration Service says about a third of native-born Americans could not pass that test. As diverse South Florida reflects so well, everyone has an ancestor whose blood and struggle paved the way for us to be so comfortable in our freedoms, be they British revolutionaries, African slaves, women suffragists, European Holocaust survivors, or this hemisphere's political exiles. In their honor, could you pass that test? We have a link to it on local10.com. Take it and see how you do, and let us know.
Well, give me liberty or give me a civics test. All right, Glenna, well said. Anyway, we're glad you were with us on this 4th of July holiday. Stay informed, get involved.
We'll have a great Sunday. Go girls soccer.